Assalamu alaikum. We will begin with lecture 25 today, and in the previous lecture we discuss this other poem by William Butler Yeats, the renowned 20th century poet of Ireland. And I discussed with you also how Yeats is a prominent figure amongst the 20th century poets, and we also looked at some of the salient features of his poetry. And we saw how in the 20th century the symbolism and this highly extreme form of symbolism, it becomes popular with most of the poets. And this was a phenomenon not just with poets, but also with the novelists and other genres of literature. Literature was becoming more and more symbolic, and a really diffuse kind of symbols and complex imagery was employed by the writers and the poets of this period. And it had a lot to do with the current political and the social situations of the time. The two world wars took place in the 20th century, and we saw how in the backdrop of the First World War, the Irish freedom struggle is also gains momentum. In the last poem, which was the Easter Rising 1916, we saw how the national freedom struggle of the Irish people, it gains momentum, and they now initiate and go for a political and a physical step to safeguard their own freedom, or to take freedom, snatch it from the hands of the British who were ruling over them. And basically the leaders of the uprising or the revolt had thought that the British was and all the allies, they were involved in the First World War against the Germans and the Russians, so they would not have enough time and enough military support to to look after affairs in this small country, Ireland. But they were wrong, because just when they had started their rebellion, the British took notice of it, and they led a strong military reaction to the movement. And the military actually suppressed this revolution, suppressed this revolt completely. So although we saw that the step or the rebellion or the revolt, it was not a success. It was a failure, because the rebellion failed to achieve its objectives, the immediate objectives at least, because they were demanding self-rule for Ireland, which the Britain had already promised that after their contribution in the First World War, it is going to grant this home rule to Ireland, which is a form of independence, but not complete independence. But this was what the Irish parliamentarians had at least succeeded in demanding from Britain at the start of the war. And Britain had promised that it would grant them home rule at the end of the war. But with this uprising in the middle of the war, things changed, and as history tells us, even at the end of the war, the promises that were made by the British government regarding the self-rule in Ireland, they were not fulfilled. So the citizens of Ireland were greatly disappointed, and they understood that they had to stand up for their own rights if they wanted freedom. So this freedom struggle gains more momentum after the uprising of Easter 1916. Most of the leaders of the rebellion were hanged or shot dead after they were caught and taken imprisoned. But the revolutionary spirit, it was passed on to the ordinary citizens of Ireland, and we see many other movements and many other political parties gaining support and sympathies of the people, and leading them eventually to a long struggle, to a long freedom struggle, which eventually, as we saw in the 20th century, they succeed in getting an independent government for their own self. So this was briefly about the previous poem that we studied, that is the Easter Rising 1916. Today the poem that we are going to look at with the title The Rose Tree, it is about the two leaders who belonged or who took part in that Easter uprising. And these two leaders were Pierce and Connolly. And this poem, the reason I've selected this poem is because it shows to you how Yeats was so influenced by this sacrifice and by the history that they had written with their own blood, that he pays tribute to them or to their sacrifices once again. And in this poem, we see that it is a complete tribute to these leaders and their sacrifices. And he's showing Ireland, and he's showing the citizens of Ireland a way forward through sacrifice. And he also shows through the poem that their sacrifices were not in vain, that their sacrifices, in fact, can be compared to Christ giving up his own life, to Christ shedding his own blood for the sake of humanity, for the purification of humanity, for the salvation of humanity. So in the same way, this sacrifice, which also involved the giving of blood, which involved deaths, so that was also meaningful. And Yeats seems to tell us here that their deaths will not go in vain. And Ireland will soon achieve its freedom. So the previous poem, as I told you, had this ambivalent tone also. In the previous poem, Yeats seems to be confused. He seems to be unsure whether to admire their efforts or to rebuke them for their urgency in taking steps, or for their, as he calls them sometimes, the ignorant wisdom. So Yeats in Easter Rising appears to be confused, appears to have this double attitude, because he constantly calls it the terrible beauty. After the sacrifice and the event, he says a terrible beauty is born. But we see to a great extent the poem was a tribute to the sacrifices of these people, and Yeats seemed to commemorate their efforts. But there was a hint of this disgruntledness, this disappointment that it should not have happened. They should not have lost their lives too soon, because he does say that they could have done much, much more for their country had they been alive. So in this poem, The Rose Tree, which I will discuss with you today, we shall see that he's paying them open tribute, and he's openly commemorating their sacrifice and their efforts for the freedom of their own country. The poem, you shall see, is brief. It's very short. It will not take long for us to finish the poem. So after this poem, we will look at another poem by Yeats in the same lecture. So the poem, what is the poem about? Now the poem describes a fictional conversation between James Connolly and Patrick Pierce, who were the leaders of the 1916 Easter Rising. So it is a conversation. The two leaders are talking to each other. That is why it is brief, and that is why that is how Yeats is giving us the opinion of these leaders and the point of view of these leaders for what they had done, for the sacrifices that they had given for their country, or for the steps that they took. And they are saying that they are willing to give their own lives to see the restoration of an Ireland governed by the Irish. So this is the whole theme of the poem, that they reaffirm that they were ready to give up their own lives to restore the freedom, to make Ireland an independent country and govern and rule by Irish people rather than by the British government. The overt symbolism, there is also an implicit meaning in the poem, and that a word symbolism is that of Christ's crucifixion. That Ireland will be resurrected anew if they spill their blood for it. So Yeats is spurning out, is elaborating their philosophy that Ireland, the country, needs their blood. The country needs their sacrifices if they want independence. So if they want their own country to be born again, to be resurrected, to be reborn. So this is this complex imagery that employs. Ireland is shown as a country which is dead now, as it is ruled by the foreign powers, by the imperial powers. So it is compared to a dead country. And he says in order for it to be resurrected, in order for it to be reborn, it needs blood. It needs the sacrifices of its own people. So this is the brief summary of the poem. Let us now look at the text itself. The first stanza. And you see the first stanza, the first few lines, they begin directly with a quotation of one of the leaders. "Oh, words are lightly spoken," it is with inverted commas, "said Pierce to Connolly." So Pierce, Patrick Pierce, is speaking to James Connolly first. The Pierce is saying, "Oh, words are lightly spoken. Maybe a breath of poetic words has withered our rose tree. Or maybe but a wind that blows across the bitter sea." The poem apparently is simple, the language is simple, but you shall see that as is the method with Yeats, he employs complex symbols, he employs complex imagery, and the beauty is to understand those images, to understand those symbols in order to truly understand the meaning of the poem. He says, "Oh, words are lightly spoken." The words here refer to the promises being made, to the verbal promises that the British government had made to the Irish parliamentarians, the promises that it had given to them before the war, that they would be granted self-rule at the end of the war. Or maybe Yeats may be referring to other promises made by the British government for the Irish people. But he says, so words are lightly spoken. The words have no worth. The words seem to fade away. The words seem not to have carry any importance or any significance. And then he says, maybe a breath of politic words has withered our rose tree. Now, rose tree is also the title of the poem. He says, maybe these words, these politic words, as he called them. So politic words here refers to the words which are not sincere, the words which are not honest, the words which are only diplomatic in nature. And so he says maybe these words or this dialogue, this talk, this has withered our rose tree. Rose tree here is a symbol of Ireland. It stands for Ireland. And the title of the poem, The Rose Tree, actually means Ireland. So the poem is about Ireland. The poem is dedicated to Ireland. So he says it is this dialogue, this false, dishonest, and not true. This kind of dialogue, this kind of talk, this kind of discussion, this has withered. This has caused our beautiful land to wither. It has caused this beautiful country to come to this point, and it has resulted in the decay of our country, of this beautiful country, which he symbolizes and he compares to a rose tree. The rose tree creates an image for us of a beautiful tree, a tree like a bush, having dark green leaves, lovely dark green leaves, and having bright red flowers amongst those leaves. So he creates this beautiful image for us for his beautiful country, but then he mixes the two colors. He's contrasting the bright red with the bright green, and remember, green is the color of Ireland. and the national color of Ireland. And it was in the previous poem also, in the Easter Rising 1916, that he talked about the green color, and he said that from that uprising onward, whenever green will be worn, it will serve as a reminder of the efforts or the sacrifices of these people that they made on the Easter 1916. So he says maybe this false talk, this dishonest dialogue, or false promises, they have resulted in this decay. Our leaders and our citizens, they believed in the false promises of the British rulers, but he says, and what is the result? The result is that our country has decayed. Our country is destroyed right before our eyes, and there is little we've done about it. Or maybe but a wind that blows across the bitter sea. So first he blames this withering of the rose tree, or this withering or decaying of his country, to the politic words or to the false promises, and then in the last two lines he's blaming it on the wind. So he talks about another symbol now. He's talking about a wind. He says maybe it is this warm wind, and maybe it is this warm bitter wind that is blowing across this bitter sea. He calls it a bitter sea because it is a sea through which England has been able to dominate Ireland. He says that this wind, this warm, harsh wind that comes from the direction of England and that passes across the sea, and it reaches our country, and it causes the withering, the decay of our country, because it with it, when it comes, it takes back all that the country has to offer, all the riches of the country. So he's using these two symbols. He uses different symbols, and he uses them to show to us that the country is decaying, that Ireland is being affected, that Ireland and the condition of the Irish citizens and its people, that's being destroyed, and they are suffering more and more as a result of this dominance of England. So we see that the rose tree is an important symbol in this poem, and he talks about it and introduces it in the very first stanza. The rose becomes a symbol of resurrection and Ireland here. So in this stanza we saw how rose was a symbol of Ireland, because he's referring to it as Ireland, as a country which is withering and which is being destroyed because of the false promises, firstly, and secondly, due to the wind that blows across the seas and destroys the plants, and it withers the rose plant. So in this stanza, the rose is a symbol of Ireland, but we shall see in the next stanza that this rose, it becomes a symbol of resurrection. In stanza 2 he says, "It needs to be what watered," James Connolly replied. Now James is replying to what P.S. had said earlier on in the first stanza. James says it needs to be watered. P.S. had described the situation in Ireland. He had described the pathetic condition of Irish people, but Connolly is now offering solution. He says it needs to be watered. He says the plant is withering because of the harsh wind that is blowing through our country. He says the rose plant is withering, so it needs water to make the green come out again and spread on every side, and shake the blossom from the bud to be the garden's bride. Now he says we need to water the plant if we want the green to come out again, if we want this withering to stop, if we want the green to come out again. Also means, because remember the green is a symbol, national color of Ireland. So he says in order for our country, in order for England to be, in order for Ireland to be known all across the globe, to be spread if we want our country's name to be spread across the globe, spread on every side, if we want the green to come out again, if we want Ireland to be reborn, to be born again, and to be known to the world as a separate, independent country, and if we want to shake the blossom from the bud, bud, you know, is the unopened, not yet opened, the newly formed flower. So he says, if we want the flower to blossom from that blood, from that bud, we need to water the plant. So in order for the green to come out, in order for to make Ireland proud amongst the other nations and other countries, and to make it blossom, to make it spread its fragrance, and to make it spread its beauty all over the globe, he says, and to make it the garden's bride. The garden may be a symbol here of this earth, and he says, if we want to make it the pride, a proud country amongst the other countries or nations of this world, we have to water the plant. We have to water it. We have to restore its energy. We have to restore its life. So the country is like that rose tree or plant. It is drying up and it is dying, but only water, it can restore its health. Water can give it back its life and its vitality and its pride. The most important thing is its pride, its name amongst the independent countries around the world. And that is what they were trying to accomplish. Then in the last stanza, Pierce says to Connolly, but where can we draw water? Now the problem is that they don't know where to get that water from, which will revive, give life to the rose tree. When all the wells are parched away, he says, when all the wells are parched away, there's no water in the wells. The wells are thirsty themselves. They are empty. There's no water in the wells. Now, the wells here may also be symbolic. The wells are maybe the symbols of the leaders, the Irish leaders, or the Irish elite in Ireland, who were casual and callous, and who were selfish, and who were not able to lead the country out of those the troubles that they had. So he says, when all the wells are also parched away, they are empty, they don't have nothing to offer. They have nothing to offer. They have nothing to give to this country. Oh, plain as plain can be. There's nothing but our own red blood can make a right rose tree. And then the conclusion that he makes is, since there is no water, he says, we can only make the right rose tree by giving our own red blood. We know that blood is red in color. Red is the color of the blood, of the human blood, and there are no two opinions about it. But still, Yeats emphasizes this red color of the blood. He says, there's nothing but our own red blood. He could have said, there's nothing but our own blood. And we know that blood carries a red color, but he wants to emphasize the redness. He wants to emphasize the red color, because he says, he's talking about the sacrifice here. Red is a symbol of love, true, but red is also the symbol of sacrifice. So he says, it would be through our own sacrifices. It is by spilling our own blood. It would be by reddening this earth. It would be by offering our own blood to this sacred plant, to this sacred special country, our country, Ireland, that we can make the right rose tree, or we can make the proud Ireland. So he, through these three stanzas, Yeats has used images, but those images are symbols. So they become complex symbols, because each of the image that he uses, it refers about something related with Ireland, related with the country. So when you interpret the poem, you will interpret the poem literally. One is a literal interpretation of the poem, where wells are wells and where blood is blood, where the rose tree is rose tree. But the other is a deeper and the symbolic interpretation of the poem, where all these images, they become symbolic, and they represent on the political front of Ireland, and on the and considering the social situation of Ireland, they represent a deeper thought. They represent the ground realities in Ireland. So the poem, in fact, not just this poem, but all poems of Yeats are to be read on, on these two levels, on the literal, the surface level, and then there is the deeper connotations, or the deeper meaning has to be understood. The symbols have to be dug in, and they have to be understood, because with them lies the true meaning of the poem. Without those, the meaning of the poem is irrelevant, is meaningless. So very simple, short poem we saw, but with the use of complex imagery and complex symbols, Yeats is able to achieve a unity, a harmony, and he is able to give reassurance, and he is able to give tribute to the sacrifices of the leaders and of the people of Ireland, who were ready to lay down their own lives for the sake of their own country. And here he seems to accept, and there is no ambivalent attitude here, because he says that the country needs their blood, the country needs their sacrifices. So now there is all this double thinking, that whether the laying down of the lives was needed or not. There are no two opinions here. He seems to be saying through the mouth of James Connolly and Patrick Pearse, that the blood is needed, that sacrifices are needed if the country is to seek independence from England. And the poem, as you can see, evokes many themes. There are references to many things, the references to Irish folklore, references to spirituality, to the unrequited love, and Ireland's struggle for independence. These are the different planes on which the story can be read. When we discussed the poem, we discussed it as the Ireland struggle for independence, and the need for sacrifices, the need for spilling of the blood for the country. But the poem also evokes the Irish folklore. In the Irish folklore, in the Irish myths, the rose tree is an important symbol, and it is an important symbol of resurrection. So Yeats is incorporating that into the poem. The poem is also has got this spiritual atmosphere, because we see that he's talking about he's creating the image of crucifixion, and how he does that. Crucifixion, we see that when he's talking about spilling the blood, the red blood, in the last stanza, he is automatically creating before us this, the image of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Christ also laid down his own life for all mankind, for the sins of all mankind. He took up upon himself the burden of all mankind according to the Christian belief, and he laid down his own life. He spilled his own blood, and this sacrifice was accepted by the Lord, and humanity was forgiven. Mankind was forgiven. So it is this image of Christ's crucifixion that is created in the last stanza, that gives the poem a spiritual kind of atmosphere, and a spiritual a meaning is also apparent in the poem. And another theme can be that of the unrequited love. If you read it literally, the poem may also be exploring how, because Yeats suffered from this unrequited love in his own personal life also. I did talk about in the previous lecture when I told you that this girl Maud Gonne, a nationalist also, whom Yeats was madly in love with and had also proposed to her thrice, but every time she turned down his offer, and she married another nationalist, but her marriage with him was also not successful, and after a year or two that marriage ended. But Yeats always, for a long time felt that his love was unrequited, that it was not fulfilled, he never got it back. He loved, it was a one-sided love. So the theme of unrequited love can also be traced through the poem, because this flower here, rose, I told you also, is a symbol both of sacrifice and of love. So we can take it as a symbol of love, where it is love which is not returned and love which is not consumed. So he may be expressing that kind of love, but love for his beloved, but also love for his country. So he says he may be saying that he needs to do more, he needs to make sacrifices to get the attention of his beloved, or he needs to give sacrifices for the love of his country in order to make it alive again. So we can trace these other numerous themes in the poem, because Yeats is employing symbols, and when symbols are used, there can be multiple interpretations of the poem, and this is the beauty of the 20th century poets. Their works are highly symbolic, and the interpretations can be various, and the reader, he is moved in different directions. But the major focus, I'm sure you would agree, the major focus of the poem was on the Irish struggle for independence, because this was a dialogue between the two Irish leaders who had offered their own lives, given up their own lives, and who had given sacrifice for the sake of their country. So that remains the major and the most powerful theme of the poem. Yeats helped lead Irish Renaissance that sought to restore the influence of Gaelic language and culture on Irish literature. I felt that you need to keep that in mind here also, because Yeats, and I mentioned in it in the previous lecture also, so I'd like it to be reinforced that this Irish Renaissance, this revival of new kind of literature, is for that Ireland is indebted to Yeats. So he was trying to restore the Gaelic language and culture on Irish literature. So we see that is why we see all these cultural images or symbols being used in his poem, because his main focus was to revive the Irish culture, and this was in line with the political movement, because on the political front they were seeking an independent status for Ireland, and on the culturally also they wanted to show to the world that Ireland is a separate entity with its own culture, separate from England. So this was the first poem that I said we would look in this lecture today. The Rose Tree, a highly symbolic poem. This other poem that I'm going to discuss with you now, which has the title Wild Swoon at Cool. This is a poem which is different in nature from these first two poems that you have studied so far. And I would like to do it with you in order to offer you a break from these intense and complex symbols that we have been trying to interpret. And I would like you to get a break from the from the political history and the social troubles of Ireland, and to show to you this other side of Yeats, and to show to you how complex and how variable he is as a poet also. We see him experimenting with different themes, with different concepts, and so this is why he is a poet of par excellence. So we shall study this poem, a poem which is far removed from the nationalist freedom movement that we have been discussing in the previous two poems. And it may come to you even as a romantic kind of a poem, because the poet is at a place where he's enjoying the beauty of nature. He is reminded of the troubles. Naturally, he could not separate himself from what and who he was, but primarily we see that it is about the beauty of the nature and how the poet feels soothed when he is surrounded with nature. So a totally different poem. It will relax you also, and it will also show you this other side of Yeats. The next two poems, in fact, that I will do with you in the next two lectures, they are also highly complex. So I need you to prepare well and to be at your best for those poems. So take a break with this poem and enjoy this poem so that you're ready for a higher dose in the next two lectures. Now in the stanza 1, he's describing this place that he's visited after 19 years. Now Yeats is visiting this place after 19 years, and it is lake at Augusta Gregory School Park. Yeats visits the lake at Augusta Gregory School Park after 19 years and is inspired by the beautiful serene surrounding while the day is drawing to its close. It is twilight, as he will tell us. The light is falling thin now, and it is getting darker. So the day is coming to an end, and it is that time, this twilight time, either in the early morning or in the late evening, that everything becomes quiet, that the birds chirping becomes faint, and a silence seems to discern. A silence seems to come down upon nature, and it is in this at this moment that the poet feels serene, at peace, and he feels peace at heart. So he begins with the description of the nature. He says, the trees are in their autumn beauty. The woodland paths are dry. Under the October twilight, the water mirrors a still sky. So everything is silent, everything is still. The scene before him, still and silent, and he's mesmerized by the beauty of the scene. He describes the trees to be in their autumn beauty. Now, autumn and beauty, we may say that these are contradictory, but I wouldn't call it that, because autumn, although autumn is a season we know reminds everyone of the winter that is about to come. So there is sadness mingled with happiness. But he calls the trees full of autumn beauty, because in the autumn season we know the trees take different shades. The leaves upon the trees take different shades. There are shades of red, there are shades of yellow, there are shades of purple and oranges. So these different shades of leaves, they give a different kind of beauty to these trees. So he is admiring the beauty of the trees. He's admiring this autumn beauty. And he says the woodland paths are dry. It is autumn season. There are no rains. It is a season of harvest. So it is a season overlooking the winter season, overlooking snow and death. But at this time there are no rains. So the paths, he says, the paths in the forest. So he is going towards the lake. He's moving through this forest that borders the lake. He is admiring the beauty of the trees. He's going on those woodland paths, and he says the paths are also dry under the October twilight. And when he reaches the lake, he notices the water of the lake, which is still, which is not moving, which is not in motion. He says under the October, and autumn comes in the October season, but he says in this October evening, the sky is mirrored in the sky, in the water of the lake, because the lake water is not turbulent. It is not moving. There are no waves. So it is still, he says, the sky is mirrored into the sky. And the sky must be, it is evening time, the sky must also be in different colors and different shades. So the beautiful sky to be reflected in the still water of the lake must have created a beautiful scene. So he describes the beauty of the scene. In their part, for us maybe it is difficult to imagine, but in their parts of the world, autumn is really a beautiful season. It is a season of different colors. That is why we see so many poets talking about the autumn season. And we also see so many poets, including the romantics, talking about the spring season, because there is a sudden change in nature in these two seasons. There are extreme changes in nature in these two seasons. And most of the poets, the Western poets, mirror that change in their poetry. They show it, they reflect that change in their poetry. So autumn is a season of colors and fullness and beauty for these poets. In the next two lines he says, upon the brimming water among the stones are 59 swans. But then he also notices that the water is not empty. There are swans which are flowing on the water. The title of the poem should also reflects that he's going to talk about swans. So he says swans are beautiful birds. They are beautiful large birds, normally of white color. They belong to the duck family. I explained in some other poem to you also when we were, I think, discussing Matthew Arnold. So he says there were 59, there were 59 swans. He was able to count those swans also. He says they were 59 in number. This was maybe a habit with Yeats, because he's going to take us into his past in the next stanza, where he tells us that he was, in the past also, he counted the swans. So he says he counted them and they were 59. Upon the brimming, the full, brimming means the full water, among the stones are 59 stones. So near the shore of the sea, not in the center, because it is evening time, the swans must be resting. They must have come back to their resting places. They have come to the shores where there are stones along on the beach. So they were resting on those stones, the 59 swans. In the next stanza he says, the 19th autumn has come upon me. And it is here that he tells plainly that the 19th autumn, it is after 19 years, after 19 autumns, that he is visiting this place again. The 19th autumn has come upon me since I first made my count. I saw before I had well finished all suddenly mount and scatter wheeling in great broken rings upon their clamorous wings. Now here he describes what he saw, or his experiences of his previous visit, the visit before 19 years ago. You can compare and understand this poem better if you compare it to Tintern Abbey, where, if you recall, Wordsworth was also visiting that place after a lapse of some years, 5 as he mentions in the poem. So he also visited Tintern Abbey after a lapse of some years, and he was also describing to you the changes that he felt in himself and the changes that he also witnessed with regard to his relationship with nature. So we see Wordsworth also describing how changed he was upon this second visit. Here also we see Yeats talking about the change, talking about comparing how it was in the past and how it is in the present, and how changed he is from his previous visit. So he says, in the last visit, when I had first made my count, when I began my counting, before I had well finished, before I had even stopped counting, before I had counted those swans all, he says, they suddenly mounted. So maybe they got aware of the presence of the poet, that they all felt afraid and they all flew away. So they all mounted, he says, mounted the air and scatter, wheeling in great broken rings upon their clamorous wings. Look at the words that he's using. Great broken rings upon their clamorous wings. So he says the swans flew, they took flight when he was still counting, and they split up in rings. When the birds normally move, we know that they move in circles. And again, this image of circle is something that Yeats uses often in his poems, as we shall see in the next two poems that I will discuss with you. So moving in rings, he tells us, the birds flew up in the air, but they flew in, he tells us, great broken rings. They flew in rings, but the rings were broken at many places. And this broken imagery of broken things is also common, a feature of Yeats's symbols. Upon their clamorous wings, and naturally as they flew above the poet, the sound must have been really loud, so he calls it clamorous wings. The sound of their flapping wings, that must be really loud. So the word that he's used is clamorous. He's describing to you what happened in the last visit. When he visited, the birds got frightened, or they were made aware of his presence, and they all flew with a noisy sound and started moving in broken rings above in the sky. In the last two lines he says, I have looked upon those brilliant creatures, and now my heart is sore. So just like Wordsworth in Tintin Abbey says that upon his second visit, he could hear the still sad music of humanity when he was amongst surrounded with nature. Here, Yeats also says that now when he's visiting this place again, and when he sees these beautiful, brilliant creatures, he's reminded of something, but he's reminded of something sore and sad. He says, now my heart is sore. So he has changed. His life has changed from when he visited it 19 years ago. He may here be referring to his unrequited love. He may here be referring to the First World War, and he may here be referring to this Irish Easter Rising 1916, the uprising when he lost many of his close friends. So, but he says, my heart is heavy, my heart is bleeding, my heart is suffering, my heart is in pain. So he feels sad at the moment. So when he looks at the beautiful creatures, he cannot enjoy the beauty of the scene completely. His heart is filled with sadness. This was the stanza 3. So in the next part of the stanza 3, he says, all's changed since I, hearing at twilight, the first time on this shore, the bell beat of their wings above my head, trod with a lighter tread. He says, all is changed since then. Since my previous visit, he means his previous visit, everything has changed. And again, this everything that he's saying, all that has changed, it may be anything. It can be the First World War that has changed the course of and has brought upon more problems for Ireland, or the Irish Civil War, or the Easter Rising 1916, which had changed everything in Ireland, or his own unrequited love. He says, hearing at twilight, the first time on this shore. So when I heard these birds, the flapping of the wings of these birds, everything has changed since then. The bell beat of their wings above my head trod with a lighter tread. He says everything is changed now. Now he says, I tread. Tread is to walk carefully. He says, now I tread with a lighter tread. Now I walk with a lighter tread. Now I walk with light steps in order not to disturb the swans. So in the previous visit, maybe because he was callous, he was casual, so the swans became frightened of him, and the moment they saw him, they flew away. But now he says, I have learned now, I have changed, and I now tread with lighter steps. he may here be referring also to the change in his own attitude towards the Irish Civil War or the freedom struggle. In the fourth stanza he says, unwearied still, lover by lover, they paddle in the cold, companionable streams or climb the air. He brings us back to the scene before us. So because this time he was careful, he did not disturb the swans. He trod, as he tells us, he trod carefully, softly and stealthily and without any noise. So he says the birds, the swans were they were undisturbed. Unwearied, he uses a word here. Unwearied means not tired. He says although the full day had passed, the whole day they must have flew in the air above. They may have swum in the lake pool, in the lake or the water, but he says they were still not tired. And lover by lover they paddle in the cold, companionable streams or climb the air. And swans are known to move in pairs, in couples you can say. So it is odd, in fact, that when he counted these swans in the first stanza of the poem, you notice he said there were 59. So 59 is an odd number. So what he's telling us is that there were pairs, but there was one which was single, because 58 would make equal pairs, and 59 is the odd number, is the one who's single out. So he says that unwearied still. Maybe that odd swan that he mentions, it is him. He is one who's lonely. He is one whose love is unrequited. He is one who does not have a partner, who still doesn't have a life partner. So he says these swans, they were unwearied. They were not tired because they had a partner, because they had support maybe. So with their lovers, they were paddling in the cold water, in the cold streams, and he calls them companionable streams. So the streams was also their companions, or climbed the air, or they flew in the air. But they flew in pairs always, with each other's support. Their hearts have not grown old. Passion or conquest wander where they will, attend upon them still. Now this here can be compared to the human condition. He says their hearts, the hearts of the swans, have not grown old. They have not changed. The poet here, Yeats here, may be comparing them to his own attitude, like he told us in stanza 2, that he has changed. He has changed, he tells us, but he says their hearts have not changed. The poet's heart has changed, but their hearts have not grown old. They are still young at heart. They are still moving around with a pair, with a lover. And passion or conquest wander where they will. So in their hearts the passions are still young. The feelings and emotions are still young. They have not become old. Their feelings and emotions and passions have not died out. They still feel strongly. Or conquest, or the desire to win over, the desire to do something, to bring about change, the desire to take somebody's attention, the desire to win someone's heart, or the desire to change the circumstances, he says. So these passions and this desire for conquest, for victory, it is still strong in these birds. And then he says, wander where they will. This here refers to the sense of freedom that these birds have. He says, wander where they will. They are free to move wherever they want to. Attend upon them still. So he says, these passions and conquests, he's talking about them, that they attend upon them still, that they're still moved by passions and the desire for conquest, desire for victory. The poet here may be lamenting his own losses. He feels that as he is growing older, he is feeling empty. As he's growing older, his passions are dying out. His desire to achieve his goal, or his and the energy that he had to bring about the victory or the conquest, he says that is dried up in him. But these birds are still young, they're still alive with passion and with desires. So the poet is comparing in the end, which is typical of poets, and we saw it was also typical with words, was also he's comparing these objects of nature, and he's comparing their sense of freedom and their sense of the sense of happiness that they exude. He's comparing it to his own feelings. And while these birds are happy and they are free, the poet is not. His country is not free. He is not a free citizen. And there are limitations on his movements also. And his passions and his desires, they have also dried up within. He feels that he has lost them. Maybe it is his despair because his beloved has turned down his offers, offers of marriage. So he feels that he's a chained man, and he's chained because he's reached old age now. He has become old. So his feelings have become old too. His feelings have changed too. There may be a guilt here that the poet is expressing. In the next stanza he says, "But now they drift on the still water, mysterious, beautiful. Among what rushes will they build?" He says now he sees them drifting on the still water. He says they were on the stones, but now he says they now drift. They are now upon the surface of the lake. They drift, he says. They drift on the still water, on the peaceful, calm water of the lake. And he calls them mysterious and beautiful. So the place and the swans, they are still beautiful. And they are mysterious. Mysterious because the poet is unable to understand how is it that they still keep all those passions alive and all those desires alive, all that happiness about them, all that beauty with them, and all that freedom. How is it that they have that all with them still? Because the poet is unable to understand why such objects of beauty always remain so, and why the poet changes his feelings, his inner and the external physical appearance also changes as he ages. So he calls them mysterious because he's able to understand their condition or their world. Among what rushes will they build? But by what lake's edge or pool delight men's eyes when I awake someday to find they have flown away? Then he asks this long question. He says, where will they make their nest? Where will they make their home? Because the ducks are migratory birds, swans are also. But he says, so they may move to another lake. So by which lake's edge or by which pool's edge will they make their home, their new home? And they will be a delight to anyone. As they are now delighting the poet, he says they will offer delight to anyone. He says, so when I may wake up someday, I may find that they are not here. So there is this regret, this fear that he may lose this beauty, or he may lose the sight of this beauty, or he may lose sight of this beautiful bird, of this beautiful scene, or this beautiful birds. So, but here there may be this other interpretation that he's talking about his own, the fears that his own dreams have fled away from him. So he's afraid that his dreams, his passions, his desires, they have dried up in him. And he's afraid that when he will awake completely, he will find that all those desires, passions, and dreams, they were just dreams and not real. And it may be like a nightmare. So this is this fear of aging here, because the poet is now aging. He feels that all those youthful qualities he's losing, and they have fled away from them. So it is like, for him, it is like waking from a deep sleep, where all was well, all was good, all was passionate, all was desirous, all was sensuous, all was beautiful, all was full of energy, all was freedom. But now, as he ages, things will become will change. Things will become bitter. So this is how Yeats, we see how he's talking about his personal fears. He's talking about his personal dreams, and he takes us away, at least for a brief moment, from the political situation of his country. Now, a brief analysis of the poem. The poem we see is set in 5 stanzas of 6 lines each. The lines are, we see, that are of varying length, but they are long and short, tend to alternate. The rhyme scheme is A, B, C, B, D, D. The poem is an evocative poem in which Yeats uses a setting and the memory of an experience, now being relived, to express his awareness of the aging process. This is the theme of the poem. So the setting is peculiar. The memory is used. 2 things that he uses to evoke a feeling is a particular setting and then a memory of his past experience. Through these, he's trying to relive the situation, and he's expressing how he is aging and how those dreams and desires are getting dried up inside him, while the nature seems to remain the same. The season of autumn and the time of twilight symbolize the process of aging as nature dies away and light fades. There may be these hidden symbols behind these 2 also. So we see that autumn, like autumn gives us the hint of this year coming to the close, of that year coming to the close now with winter. So also the autumn is like the end of youth, and winter is compared to old age. So autumn comes after the prime season, which is the summer season, and after the prime youthful life, the poet is now on the border between that prime youth and old age. He is at that age when he's about to enter the last phase, that is the old age. So the season for autumn is symbolic in that sense, and similarly the twilight. It's the evening time that he's talking about, when the day is coming to its close. So the day as a symbol of youth, and night as a symbol of old age, where all desires and all light fades from the hope it fades away from the life. The beauty and freedom of the swans create a contrast with Yeats's experiences through sight and sound effects. The beauty of the poem is that Yeats uses sensuous imagery, like Keats and other romantic poets. He uses this sensuous imagery of sight and sound effects. He gives us the clamorous sounds of the wings of the birds as they fly above his head, and he describes to us the beautiful images that he sees. So it is a sensuous poem. So he creates these contrasts between his own feelings, between what he's feeling inside and the scene outside, through this sensuous imagery. The birds have not aged or lost their passion, but Yeats is aware that as youth passes, the passions are lost. So like Keats, he's talking about an object of nature. Here he's talking about nature as the object of permanence, where nothing changes, and is comparing it to his own self, where nothing is permanent. So the birds, he says, have not aged. They have not lost their passions. They're still the same. The swans are as beautiful as they were, as he says, 19 years ago, which we know is highly, it's highly dramatic on part of the poet to think that these are the same swans. But what he means is that they are always beautiful. So he says they are the same always, but he says his own youth is passing, and his passions and his beauty he's losing those things. There is a sad reality that aging is inevitable and that the change has to be confronted and accepted. And through the poem, the harmony or unity is created with this idea that in every stanza we get the feeling of acceptance. So Yeats does bring to light this sad reality that aging will occur. He cannot stop it, that it is part of the human life. It cannot be stopped, but he says that he can at least confront it. He can at least face it boldly, and he can accept it. So, and it is this acceptance that is part of the poem. We see that poet is coming to terms with old age. The poem is showing his own, although with a sad feeling, with a truly sad feeling, but he's coming to terms with old age. He's showing that he needs to accept the change because it is part of life. But there is this sad feeling when he sees nature, observes nature, and he sees the beauty in the nature and the natural world. He contrasts it with his own self, that due to the cyclic nature or the cyclic pattern in nature, the beautiful seasons are repeated, the beauty is repeated. But for man, there is no such thing. For man, there is a linear process. There is a linear, the time is linear. From childhood, man reaches his youth, from youth to adulthood, and from adulthood to old age. So the poet is now, it's lamenting the change of time, the loss of youth, the loss of passions, the loss of emotions, the loss of desires, the sensuous desires, or the loss of freedom, because youth is free, youth is rebellious. So he is lamenting upon those losses, and he is lamenting upon the feeling, the idea of temporariness, of beauty and of youth. But he seems to accept it boldly, and he seems to accept it as fact of life bravely towards the end of the poem, but though with great sadness. So this was this second poem that I said we will look at in this lecture. And as you can see, this is different from the other two poems that I have discussed with you. The poem is soft, and the poem is personal, and the poem talks about the poet's own worries regarding the old age. And we shall discuss another poem by Yeats, a very, very well-known poet of Yeats, in which the main theme is old age. And we shall see how the same fears are also tackled in that other poem. In fact, in my next lecture, I am going to discuss that other poem with you, with the title Sailing to Byzantium. And the main theme of that poem is also how old age is a time of regret, and how old age is something that saddens the poet, and he wants to be rid of it. So the main theme of that other poem is also old age, and we shall see how he tackles it in that other poem in the next lecture. For today's lecture, I think this should suffice. We have discussed two poems, and Yeats has employed various symbols in both the poems, and it is because of the symbolic words of the poems that they become important, and they offer an important study, and they can be interpreted at different levels. So it is important that you understand those symbols that he employs in the poems. The symbols can be from anywhere. The symbols can be from nature, they can be from the Greek myths, or they can be evoked from the Christian biblical knowledge. So you have to be ready for those symbols, and whatever they are and wherever they are, they carry a deeper interpretation of the poem, the interpretation that may lead us to the real meaning of what Yeats intended in the poem. So the symbolic interpretation is important. That would be all for today's class, and I shall meet you again in the next class with the next lecture. Till then, I take leave. Thank you.